When Tesla introduced their refreshed Model S and X, the interior feature most talked about was the Yoke style steering. I've already done a video discussing why I don't think the shape of the Yoke will make things easier or better or safer for a Tesla driver, and you can find that linked in the video description. However, I feel quite the opposite about their plans for moving controls from physical stalks to buttons mounted on the hub. In order to form a more educated opinion, I mocked up the same controls on the spokes of my Model 3 steering wheel. It's just pen on painter's tape, but this is all I really need to get a literal feel for whether or not I'd be able to find controls on the spokes of a steering hub that don't actually exist as physical buttons.
So this is far from perfect, but this is a pretty good facsimile of where the buttons would be if this were the hub in the refreshed Model S or X. One of the first things I want to point out is that you don't actually need to have a yoke like you see in the Model S and X refresh renders in order to have buttons like these on a steering wheel, on the hub. Of course, you'd have to make this area different than you see in this Model 3 steering wheel, but you could easily put the same touch capacitance panels here and here on the spokes on a standard steering wheel. Tesla is putting the controls on the hub here because they want to get rid of these stalks. And I'm actually in support of this as an idea overall. But I think in order to talk about how Tesla seems to be doing this in the refreshed Model S and X, we need to break the discussion into three parts. The first part is, does putting these controls on buttons on the hub make things better, easier, safer? And I think overall, yes, I think that this is a very good idea. The second thing has to do with the touch capacitance. Does touch capacitance as a method of indicating where you're pressing work better than a standard button? And I'm more on the fence. I want to see how they do it because there's some pretty cool things that you can do with touch capacitance, such as with the wipers, you might press to get momentary. You might swipe up to increase the speed. You might swipe down to decrease speed. You might press and hold to turn it off. That's just one of the ways that they could use multi-gesture control for any one of these buttons with a touch capacitance pad. However, we don't know if they're going to do that. The remaining question for me with the panels as they're shown in the render is that there's no real point of reference for you to know where your fingers are. You're going to kind of have to get muscle memory for the upper part of the left upper spoke being the right turn signal, the lower part being the left turn signal, this being high beams on and off, this being where the horn is. I think you can do that, but the question remains, how hard is it going to be to adapt to that? And this is kind of an attempt for me to see what that's going to be like. The third part of the discussion really is about getting rid of the gear selector. Now, it's not actually selecting a gear, but let's just call it that for simplicity's sake rather than saying PRND selector or anything like that. You need some way of telling the car to go into drive or to reverse or park or even neutral, and we'll just call that the gear selector. Well, they're getting rid of the gear selector in the Model S and X refresh. It's not actually going here, but I'm going to save that for a discussion later. So right away I would hit there instead of double tapping down. I think that's easy enough. And it's an easy enough thing to remember where it is. I think that's going to be no problem developing muscle memory to tap there to activate traffic aware cruise control, probably with one tap, and full autopilot with auto steer with two taps. The Yoke and the Model S and X refresh have these same scroll wheel buttons, which leaves me wondering why there's a separate voice activation button here, because in the Model 3 and the Model Y, you just press and hold that, and then you get voice activation. You get the voice recognition. I don't understand why it needs to be a separate button when you already have the scroll wheel. But that's that's something that it's going to be fine. You're going to remember where that is, I think, pretty easily. The jury's still out as to whether or not it's necessary or better for the Model S and X to have that button separate from the scroll wheel like you find it in the Model 3 and the Model Y. Okay, so I'd be hitting that, and it might be a long press for a full activation of the turn signal. It might be a short press for a momentary activation. I also saw where they think it might be force touch, meaning that if you just put your finger on the turn signal button, it might be momentary, but if you push hard, then it will be more of a full activation. I just don't know how that's going to work. All right, so I would want to be getting out of autopilot smoothly, so I would tap that. I'm just going to tap up and I feather the accelerator. That's way better than tapping the brake, but that's easy enough to do. And then here I would tap the right turn signal to activate it, whatever that would be. And then maybe double tap to activate full autopilot. I know some people are going to say, well, these are here because you have a yoke, so your hands are always going to be here. But it doesn't really matter if you think about it, because with a wheel, your hand might be up here. You still have to move your hand down to activate this stalk. You still have to move your hand down or up to activate this stalk. So to me, it doesn't matter whether you're driving with a yoke or a wheel. I think that there's actually a lot of advantage to having all of these controls on the hub instead of a stalk. Sure, if you're driving this like you have a yoke, which you can do with a standard wheel like I showed in my other video, you're always going to have these buttons right here. But even in a standard wheel, you're going to have the spokes as kind of an index point for your hands that will then get you to that next point where just from your memory, you're going to know right here is the right turn signal. Right here is the left turn signal. So just looking at these, it makes sense that there's the light activation on this side, and then there are the other controls on this side. But I think they can do away with this. I just wonder why they've decided to pull this separate from the multifunction control wheel. And I guess for these kinds of things, you would just tap there instead of tap down there. That's going to be easy enough. That's really going to be super easy to remember. Yeah, very quickly, I'm already convinced that a lack of physical buttons to feel under your fingers isn't going to be a problem, because the spokes of the yoke are already going to index your hands, and then you're just going to remember where you need to press from there. One of the challenges that I want to see how they handle with the touch capacitance is, what do you do if you're wearing gloves? They make gloves that have the threads in them so that you can use an iPhone or things like that. And that works for lightweight gloves like the kind that we ever use here in North Carolina. But there are places in the United States, there are places around the globe where Teslas are really popular, but they're going to get in the car with very thick gloves on. And this is even if they have the heated steering wheel or the heated yoke as it would be. So to change lanes probably is a push and hold. For auto lane change, yeah, that's going to be super easy. All right, so then I would double press there. And it'd be interesting to see what it looks like on video, because right now I'm trying to do it from memory. I'm trying to do it from muscle memory, so I think I'm doing okay. And then I tap this to indicate that I want to change lanes. Perfect. I didn't need to look at it at all. I actually can feel the tape. It feels different. So I can kind of feel it underneath. And now I'm going to deactivate autopilot because there's a puddle up here and I don't want to hydroplane. Now I'm going to set the turn signal. Ooh, I'm going to let this person get over. I'm going to give them room if they're going to do it. I can already tell you, I love having turn signals here instead of on a stalk. And then I would double tap or whatever the gesture is. And again, tap to indicate. Once again, tap to indicate that it's safe to go through. Oh yeah, I'd very much like the control on the hub versus on a stalk for that. The light control here, if the function of the lights in the refresh model S and X are the same as in the 3 and the Y, I'm almost never going to touch that because I have auto on and off for the lights already, and then I have auto high beams. However, there are times where I don't think the auto high beams are working the way I want them to, either because I'm on a road with a lot of turn signs that are highly reflective that cut off the high beams when I don't want them to, or there are cars coming at weird angles that autopilot hasn't figured out you need to have the high beams off. So I'd love to be able to toggle between auto high beams and manual high beams. Yeah, so I hope that this button in the Model S and X is multi-gesture capable, where I might have it in manual mode, and then you just tap to turn the high beams on and off, but you can toggle between manual and automatic by swiping, maybe up and down, or right to left, one or the other. I hope they allow that, because that's something that I would love with the Model 3. I'd love to be able to more easily toggle between manual high beams and automatic. So with wipers, I imagine it'll be tap for a momentary press, but I really hope that it's swipe to adjust the speed. So you can swipe up to increase the speed, swipe down to decrease the speed. And of course, you can have the menu pop up just like that, and then it scroll through the speed on the menu while you're doing your swiping. I really hope that's the way it works. And if it does, I would love to have a windshield wiper button like this. So now we're left with 2 buttons. I don't get it. I've said it a couple times. I just don't get it. That's going to be easy enough to do. But I don't know why they've taken up real estate on the touch capacitance pad with the voice activation button here when they could just as easily keep it here. That's definitely one of those things where let's see why. I just don't know. It could be a very good reason, but they haven't mentioned yet. The horn is an interesting one. At first, I was like, I don't necessarily want the horn to be here. But really what it comes down to is, I think it's a great idea to get the horn off of the airbag, where in an impending accident you hit the horn without your arms being as vulnerable to injury as if you're hitting the airbag that's going to explode under your wrist. But what I definitely would like to see is that the horn not be one little area, that maybe it's a big stripe, tap, tap, turn signal, that maybe it's a big stripe to hit. And that it be that way on both sides. Having one little area work for the horn reminds me too much of a car. I can't remember what it was. I've been a licensed driver since 1986. And I've driven many, many cars in my life. And one car that I drove, not a daily driver, had the horn on the end of one of the stalks. I can't even remember. But there was no horn on the wheel at all. Of course, this was pre-airbag anyway. But so to beep the horn, you had to hit one of the end of the stalks. That was crazy. It was dumb. There were lots of cars that were like that. I think there are lots of cars in Europe that are like that. But they went away from that and they put horns, especially in the US market here, where it's much easier to hit no matter where your hand is. But it's not dependent on the hand that's closest to that stalk being free. I can hit the horn with my right hand or my left hand the way it is now. That was the same way in my Saab 900 Turbo. It had this gigantic hub in the middle. It wasn't an airbag. It was actually multi-density safety foam, so that if you were in an accident and your head or your body bounced off of the hub, it would cushion the impact. Again, pre-airbag. But it had horn switches on every spoke, and they ran from top to bottom on the spokes, here, here, and here. And again, I would typically hit the horn like this with one hand, but I could hit it with any hand, no matter what the orientation of the wheel was. So I love the idea of Tesla getting the horn off of the airbag. I think the fact that horns have been on airbags for this long is actually pretty stupid. We drove cars for a long time that didn't have the horn centrally placed on the hub in the first place, and it worked great, and we will be able to adapt to getting back to that very well. My concern, which is definitely a wait and see, comes down to what's it going to be like trying to activate a horn with a touch capacitance button in one place on the hub. So the last thing to talk about is getting rid of a gear selector stalk. On the Model S and X currently, the gear selector and the autopilot controls are on different stalks. At least I think they are. I don't own one. But on the Model 3 and the Model Y, it is one multifunction stalk. And I actually don't like it being one stalk, because I personally, and I've shown this on video, have accidentally activated traffic-aware cruise control in a drive-through, thinking that I was actually in park getting my food from the person at the window and just putting it back into drive. Well, they were so fast I never put it into park, and I instinctively hit down on the gear selector thinking I was putting it into drive, when I actually activated traffic-aware cruise control. And when I took my foot off of the accelerator, it started to accelerate to 10 miles an hour, because that was the set speed, and it kind of took over the speed at that point. The other thing that hasn't happened to me that can happen, for whatever reason, Tesla allows you to put the car into reverse even as you're rolling forward. You don't have to be at a full stop. You don't have to have your foot on the brake to shift from drive to reverse. Well, just as you've already seen in this video, where I tap the stalk up to cancel autopilot as I feather the accelerator, because that's way smoother than tapping the brake to deactivate autopilot. If you're coming up to a stop and you had already gotten kicked out of autopilot, either on purpose with something you did or automatically and you didn't notice, and then you go to deactivate autopilot by flicking the stalk up, you can end up putting it in reverse in traffic. And there are tons of reports of people doing this. I haven't done it except to prove it to myself that it can be done. But I don't like the fact that in the Model 3 and the Model Y, the gear selector and the autopilot controls are in one stalk. So I love the fact that in the S and the X, they're maintaining a distinct separation between the autopilot controls, which will be a switch on the spoke, and the gear selection, which will be, the report is there's going to be a series of force touch buttons somewhere around here. We don't know. If there are actual buttons that you can reach and press and not have to look to know what you're pressing because there's some sort of index point, I'll be all for that. This again is one of those wait and sees, because we don't really know what they're wanting to do. All we know is it's going to be very, very different than anything that any of us have ever experienced before. And that wild card of the car taking a guess as to whether you want drive or reverse when your foot's on the brake, we don't really have a lot of information on what that means, or what the bounds of when it's going to make a guess are, or how quickly you're going to be able to switch it. So that's a whole separate thing from deciding whether or not these switches are going to make the driving experience better. I think they are. You can have switches like this and have a gear selector stalk kept if you wanted to You could have switches like this and then have one of the switches, a distinct switch for gear selection, again with swiping to go into drive or reverse. Would it know that I wanted to go in reverse? Would it know that I wanted to go into drive just like that for a 3-point turn? What if I overshot this stop because there's a hedgerow and I needed to quickly back up to get out of the way of oncoming traffic? Would I be able to do that? It seems like an edge case, but in a place like Raleigh, we've got tons of intersections with really horrible visibility to where you kind of have to put your neck out to see whether a car is coming or not. And basically, if the car is speeding, if they're breaking the law, then you might have to suddenly get out of their way. It's not about who's at fault in those situations. It's about being able to save your own skin regardless of fault, and being able to change direction from drive to reverse or vice versa at a moment's notice without taking your eyes off of traffic is an important technique for being able to do that. Overall, I love the idea of going to hub-mounted buttons. I love the idea of the potential for multi-gesture controls for each of these functions. And I'd love to see that in more than just the Model S and the X. I'd love to see that on a standard wheel and not just the yoke that you see in the renders. I am very much a fence sitter as to what Tesla means by getting rid of a physical gear selector. It seems like they don't actually mean that there's still going to be buttons that a driver can access. So the real question will be, can they be accessed quick enough to keep you safe? Can they be accessed in a way that is convenient for you when the car makes a bad decision as to whether you're going to go forward or reverse? We're actually hoping to have more information on all of this from Tesla by now, but it hasn't come. So that's why I waited a whole week to make this second part of this discussion on the yoke, as you see in the Model S and X refresh renders. When we do find out what all this is, I'm going to make an update, so be sure to subscribe so you see that. Be sure to use my Tesla Owners referral link to order a Tesla if you're looking to get one for your own. You'll get free supercharging if you do. Full details on a Tesla Owners referral program can be found at the link itself. I really appreciate you watching The Tech of Tech, and I hope to see you next time.